I'm Mr. Robinson, and this is Criminal Law, Week 3, How Our System Works, an interactive lesson. For these interactive lessons, remember, a few things will be handy for you to have with you. Your readings, so you can refer to the online text. Your homework, so you can look back at what you wrote about this. And your own notes, because I want you to add to them. Remember, for a grade, you'll snap a photo of at least one full page of notes from this section. And along the way, you can speed me up when things are familiar to you, stop and write things down when you want more time, and go at a normal pace other times. First, we'll talk about the formal sources of law in the United States. Where do we look when we want to see national law written down? Keep this in mind. The U.S. Constitution is the law of the land, and it's the top law of the land. What it says overrides other things, like federal statutes. The word statute means written law, and the national government has lots of written statutes. In addition, there are government agencies that write rules and regulations. Those aren't the same as law, but they have the same force, and they're authorized by law. A lot of times, an agency will write rules and regulations that give more detail when a law was very general on purpose. For example, if a pollution law said, from now on we have the authority to punish people who not only pollute dangerous gases that make it hard to breathe, but also greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming, it might be up to an agency to decide exactly how much of certain substances counts as illegal and how much they should try to fine a corporation that pollutes with those gases. Those are some choices that could be set by rules and regulations. Last of all, federal court decisions are one of our formal sources of law, and we'll look pretty closely at those. At the state and local level, the same things apply. There's a state constitution, there's a set of state statutes. States have their own agencies that make rules, and they have their own courts. One new thing to add in, there are also local ordinances. That is, they don't have quite the same force of a state law, but they still can be used to ticket people in your city or town if you break the rules, like a noise ordinance, which says don't get too loud. Notice the picture? You might recognize it from Virginia Beach. Until 2020, there was a law in Virginia that made it illegal to swear in public. There might be certain constitutional issues with that law. In your notes, write down what you think might be the constitutional problem with a law that bans swearing. Virginia's General Assembly decided to repeal that law this year, at the time I'm making this video in 2020, and it's no longer on the books. So now we're going to look at what judges write. That is, when they make policy, what do they actually write down? The first thing to know is the opinion of the court. That's the thing that actually becomes the law of the land. If there's just one judge making a ruling, that's the opinion of the court. If there's a group of judges, then you need to get a majority of them. And that means there's some discussion and deliberation. Like on our Supreme Court, the very top court in the land, how many judges are there when every seat is filled? Write down that number if you know it, and we'll use it when we discuss in class. What they say, what the majority says, is called the majority opinion. That's the only one that truly matters right away in making policy. But when you agree with what the majority says about who should win, but not about why, you can choose to write a concurrence. It's optional. Judges who don't sign on to the majority could just do nothing, but often they'll write a concurrence that says, yes, I agree about who won, but I think they should have won for a different reason. Another kind of opinion worth looking at is a dissent. A dissenting opinion says, actually, I think the other side should have won. Here's an example. Get ready in your notes. I made up this case, Wong v. Chicago. Let's say there was a preacher named Lee Wong who was arrested because he told a crowded audience a hurricane was about to come at that moment to destroy them. They panic. The audience flees. 3 people are trampled and killed. And the city of Chicago charges and ends up winning at the lowest level of the court system when they try to get Wong convicted of a crime for causing this panic. Wong appeals and says, I have a right to make that claim. I can't be punished for it. Let's say, in the appeals court, Wong wins because of the freedom of religion. That is, his faith teaches he should share his views. That's what he did, and the court decides he shouldn't be punished for it, constitutionally speaking. If you were going to write a concurrence that said, yes, Wong should win, but for different reasons, can you think of a different reason why a court might also say he should not be convicted? Pause and write it down. That'll be great for discussion in class. Finally, for dissent, if a judge said, actually, I think Chicago should win, and here's why, give an example of the reasoning they could use. What's the best reason you can think of for why actually the city of Chicago should be able to punish a preacher who says a hurricane's coming right now? You don't have to know any background law for this. I just want you to think about reasons a judge might give for why that would be a good outcome for a preacher to be able to be convicted for those words that led to those results. Pause and write your best reasoning. So here's a moment for a big truth. Most of the cases in this country, by far, are heard in state courts. There's 50 states, not in federal courts. And that means criminal cases too. In this class, we'll focus on criminal law in the states, although occasionally we'll touch on federal law too. And we'll focus especially on Virginia, where we teach this class. We'll look at Virginia's code throughout the year, and it's kind of interesting to compare with other states sometimes too. So, let's look behind the scenes. What are the sources of law before we got to the written down statutes and rulings we have today? One answer to that question is common law. Over centuries in England, court decisions were laid down based on these unwritten customs about what was fair and right. And that led to a system that we call common law. Common law, then, is a collection of case law, but from a particular country and time. That is, what became written down as British common law was a consistent set of rules that other countries adopted too, including the United States. First when we were colonies, and then we became our own independent nation. These days, though, we haven't just stuck with common law. Instead, we've adopted changes to our state statutes. Some of them started out just using common law definitions that were centuries old. The Model Penal Code was an effort to update that, and we'll look at that a lot this year too. In the 1960s, a group of American lawyers put together a collection of how they thought the law should work. It wasn't a statute. They weren't government. They were just some lawyers who wanted to set an example. And they did. In fact, many states adopted pieces of the Model Penal Code, big chunks of it even, for their own states, getting rid of the old common law rules and putting in the Model Penal Code. We'll look both at common law and Model Penal Code in this class, and it'll be an updated Model Penal Code. There have been some changes. So we focused on state and national government. And one thing worth keeping in mind, like we discussed in class, is that we are a federalist system. That is a nation where two levels each have their own powers. There's some other countries that have given some power to localities. England, for example, allows London to elect its own mayor. But the United States is a system where states have inherent power that can't be taken away. And so does the national government. That's worth keeping in mind. Another thing worth keeping in mind is that we're a system where the national government has a lot of power. Even though we're federalist, the national government wins because of the supremacy clause that we discussed in class, and it also wins because it's got a lot of money. That is, even when the national government can't make things happen, they can twist arms pretty well with the use of dollars. Because we have federal taxes that take in a lot of money, we can use that tax money to persuade states to change what they do, even though they don't have to. For example, the drinking age. You probably know what the drinking age is now, 21. Write down in your notes if you know what it used to be. Because every single state ended up becoming a state that had a drinking age of 21, and that's because of national pressure. The national government threatened to take away some highway money from any state that didn't change to 21, and they all eventually did. That's the power of federal dollars at work. We'll talk about that in class too, because it's kind of fascinating. So we've got three branches of government. We've mentioned the lawmakers, the legislative body. In the United States is Congress, and in Virginia it's the General Assembly. Write down in your notes if you know the two houses of Congress, and if you know the names of the two houses of the General Assembly. Since they'll come up in conversation, it could be useful to know, and feel free to look it up too. The chief executive of both the United States and Virginia has similar powers. That is, the President of the United States can sign and veto laws. The same is true for the governor of Virginia. Write down in your notes if you know the name of the governor of Virginia. And in each level of government, there is a high court. In the U.S., the Supreme Court, and Virginia, the Supreme Court of Virginia. And each is the last word on the meaning of the law and the Constitution in the jurisdiction or the area it controls. However, the Supreme Court of the U.S. can overturn the Supreme Court of Virginia on matters involving the federal government, national law, and the U.S. Constitution. So let's look at those policies that the branches of government can make. A few things worth keeping in mind. We have so many laws because they're relatively easy to make. Not a piece of cake. Laws die all the time because they don't get passed. But they're easier, like these eggs over easy, than amendments to the Constitution. Those are hard, like these hard-boiled eggs. We'll go into a little detail on that. Government class talks about it more. But it's worth knowing and keeping in mind. It's why the U.S. Constitution has only been amended 27 times, and there are thousands and thousands of laws. State constitutions could be easier to amend. In some ways, the U.S. Constitution is harder to amend than the Virginia Constitution, which has been changed more frequently. But still, amendments are harder than laws. Good to keep in mind. The legislative branch, both national and the state level, formulates and proposes policy. That is, they write laws. They write what are called bills that they vote on, and they hope the president will sign them into law. The president might veto them instead. The same is true at the state level. The governor might veto a law. And only if there's what's called a supermajority of the legislature can they enact that law anyway. That is, if it's been vetoed, if you get a larger number to vote yes, not just a majority, which is over half, but a much bigger number, then it becomes law. At the national level, that's 2/3 of each house of Congress. That's tough. It's rare to override a veto, but it's a power that can happen at state and national levels. The executive then can act unilaterally, all by herself. The president can sign a bill into law, and she doesn't need any help for that. She can veto bills and block them, and no one else is involved in that decision. It's good to remember that executives tend to have unilateral power making, at least in some areas. And the judicial branch either has one judge or a majority of a group of judges who are deciding on what the law means and on what the Constitution means. The power of judicial review is the power to review a law and decide if it's unconstitutional and should be thrown out, or if it's constitutional and is allowed to stay on the books and be enforced. That power can only be exercised if someone sues and says, this law is hurting me and it's unconstitutional. So judges can't just look at laws in advance or give advice to the legislature. They have to wait till laws have been passed and someone sues to say, hey, this law is hurting me. Big truths. We've got a federal system of government. There's 50 different ways to run court systems, and you don't have to memorize how any one state court system looks. So even though we talk about national court systems more, I want you to focus on how the federal court system works. We are still focusing on state laws. The national court system is just one example of how a court system is organized, and many states have a pretty similar model. Here's how it works. You first go to what's called a trial court, with one judge generally, the right to a jury. You're going to bring facts. Both sides will present what they say happened, witnesses to help back that up, and the judge or the jury, when there is a jury, will decide on guilt. Here's what's worth keeping in mind. If you have the right to a jury in a criminal trial, why would you choose not to have one? You have that option to say, I just want the judge to hear my case. In your notes, write down one reason that might be. These trial courts, as we call them, like in the picture, are the kind you see on TV shows more often. At the federal level, we call those district courts, although in a few rare cases, the Supreme Court can go first, have original jurisdiction, and act a little differently than we're used to it acting. The appeals courts have what's called appellate jurisdiction, and usually that's a group of judges, no jury, who decide not about the facts, they don't hear witnesses, but just listen and decide whether there was a mistake of law in the lower court. If there was, they may overturn the lower court's ruling, reverse it. At the federal level, we're talking about the circuit courts of appeal, who have appellate jurisdiction across the country in different geographic areas. And in a relatively small number of cases every year. In 2020, the Supreme Court term that just ended, they only heard 53 cases and had signed opinions on them. The Supreme Court chooses to be a court that exercises its appellate jurisdiction pretty rarely, but it does. Lastly, let's look at what happens when a court makes a ruling. When they do so, they issue an opinion, and that becomes the law of the land in their area. It becomes what we call precedent. It precedes or comes before later cases. So later cases rely on past precedent to make their new rulings, rather than decide things from scratch each time. Precedent is binding when it comes from a court above you in your line or chain of command. So the U.S. Supreme Court, its rulings are binding on every court in the country below it. The U.S. Courts of Appeals, called the Circuit Courts of Appeals, are binding on all the district courts below them. There are several courts of appeals across the country, each representing a different geographic area, and the precedent they create, the rulings they make, command the courts below them, the district courts, on how they should consider the law. But a Virginia district court only has to listen to the Court of Appeal, the Circuit Court of Appeal that's above it, the Fourth Circuit. They don't have to listen to the Ninth Circuit, which covers California and some other western states. Instead, it's only the courts above you in your chain of command that are binding on you. Still, another court's precedent could be persuasive. The U.S. Supreme Court has no one binding it, but it still looks at lower court opinions for guidance sometimes in deciding what it will do. And it also looks back at its own previous rulings. The U.S. Supreme Court obeys what's called the philosophy of stare decisis. Let the decision stand. Most of the time, they stick with their old precedent rather than overturning it and making a new rule. But there are some notable times when the U.S. Supreme Court has overturned a previous ruling. In your notes, write down any occasion you know of where the U.S. Supreme Court made a new rule and said we were wrong before. We'll talk about that in class. Thanks, and see you next time.